Aricept was one of the first drugs to be widely used to treat Alzheimer's disease, and it is still a very popular drug in use today. Now, it's well known that Aricept, while it treats the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, it does not alter the long-term prognosis of the disease. So what we're going to do today is talk about the mechanism of action of the drug. We're going to understand how this drug works at a very small level. And by understanding this, we're going to see how it is able to treat the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, but yet still has no effect on the course of the disease. Aricept is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. Acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. And to understand the significance of this and how it works in Alzheimer's disease, we need to talk about the whole acetylcholine system in order to get an understanding, right? So here's basically how it works. I haven't done a video on it. I'm going to try to do a very quick explanation. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter. So basically how it works is you have a cell that releases neurotransmitters. In this case, acetylcholine. It releases neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters activate receptors that are particular to that type of neurotransmitter. Some receptors are for dopamine, some receptors are for serotonin, some are for acetylcholine. And once the neurotransmitter activates the receptor, the cell then activates the effects, whatever those are. So it's also important to know that neurotransmitters don't always have the same effects. A lot of times people think that, well, if dopamine is released, then it's always going to have this effect. Or if serotonin is released, it's always going to have this effect. And that's not true at all. For example, acetylcholine is used in muscle cells, so when I'm moving around, I'm using acetylcholine. Also, it's used in certain areas of the brain for memory-related functions, attention-related functions, and hence why it's used in Alzheimer's disease. So anyways, back to our simple diagram. We have our releasing cell and our receiving cell. Releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine activates the effects, and then after it's done activating the effects, there needs to be a way to get rid of this neurotransmitter. So one way is you can reabsorb it back into the cell. Another way is to break it down, and that's what acetylcholinesterase does. So if you think of my fingers are basically going to be the acetylcholinesterase. Around cells that use acetylcholine, there is acetylcholinesterase. It's one of the most efficient enzymes in the whole biological system. It breaks down like millions of acetylcholines a second. So that's how it ends the transmission. So another way to think of neurotransmission is the neurotransmitters are like a finger. They don't necessarily have any real effect. Depending on what button I press with my finger, that is basically what is going to happen. So after I push a button, often I'm going to need to let go of the button in order for it to reset the effect. So if you think of like an elevator, if it's important to hit the elevator button to call the elevator down, but unless I take my finger off the button, it's just going to stay there. The door is going to keep opening. So that's what acetylcholinesterase does. It ends the transmission. And also it has a way of basically creating a lane for the transmission. So if you think of the neurotransmitters, if they're not broken down or reabsorbed into the cell, they'll diffuse to other cells next to them. And that's not always necessarily what you want. So if you think of like the button example again, where you have a bunch of different buttons. If I press one button, I don't necessarily want to press the other buttons next to it. Sometimes I might, but I might not. So basically what this does is it keeps the acetylcholinesterase, it keeps the acetylcholine working in its lane. So a quick recap. Got a cell that releases acetylcholine. It activates the effects on the cell, whatever those may be. And in the case of Alzheimer's disease, we're talking about cells that are related to memory and different brain functions that allow people to live a normal life. And then the acetylcholinesterase breaks that down into choline and its other constituent parts. And then the choline is reabsorbed back into the top cell, and then it makes more acetylcholine, and then the process continues in this cyclic way. Releases acetylcholine, acetylcholinesterase breaks it down into choline, choline goes back up to the top cell, and then it makes more acetylcholine and the cycle continues. Now that we have that basic understanding of the acetylcholine system and how it works in the brain, let's talk about how Aricept can potentially help in Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is associated with massive neuronal death in the cholinergic system, similar to the way that Parkinson's disease is associated with massive neuronal death in the dopamine system. The same sort of principle, just different regions of the brain that have different responsibilities, so the symptoms are different. But it's it's the same. So you have a whole bunch of neurons, a brain region that has a whole bunch of neurons that are performing some job. And in Alzheimer's disease, these neurons, for whatever reason, are dying. So sometimes you can have a top cell that dies and it leaves the bottom cell that is not being activated because the top cell that releases the signal to it is dead. And sometimes you can have the bottom cell that dies and you have a top cell that's releasing a bunch of neurotransmitters, but it's no good because this cell is gone. It's not working anymore. So how does Aricept help? Aricept, remember, is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. So it stops those enzymes that are around the cell from breaking down acetylcholine. So what that will do is it will help prolong the signal of the cell, right? So if I push this button, it's going to push it for longer because it's not being broken down as quickly. But also more importantly, it will help the acetylcholine diffuse. So remember when we talked earlier about how it also helps keep it in its lanes, how you don't necessarily want to push the buttons around it. But often in a brain region, you'll have a lot of brain cells next to each other that do the same thing. And it would be nice if they were all working and they were all pushing the button when they needed to. But you potentially have a lot of cells that aren't doing anything because the cell that ordinarily activates them is gone. So what it will help do is those top cells, that the bottom cell is gone, it will help it diffuse to other cells that may have the other half that's still working. But if you have those acetylcholinesterase enzymes around it, it's basically protecting it from other acetylcholine activating it unnecessarily. So by inactivating these enzymes, it will allow the diffusion of acetylcholine to nearby cells. And basically what it does, in a nutshell, is help optimize what remains. So going back again, Aricept, we said, treats the symptoms. So how does it treat the symptoms? It helps optimize what remains, right? We might have some pieces that are still working out there, but they don't have their other half to help activate them. By increasing the amount of acetylcholine diffusion, it will help activate those remaining pieces that may be otherwise functional, but without their other counterpart, don't work very well. And again, back to the disease prognosis. So we also said that while it treats the symptoms, it does not help in the long-term course of the disease. So why would that be? Again, let's go back into the mechanism of action, how this works. So this helps prolong the signal, and it helps make use of what is remaining. But still, Alzheimer's disease is associated, again, with neuronal death in the cholinergic system. So how does inhibiting acetylcholinesterase help in the long-term prognosis of disease? It doesn't. Neurons are still going to be dying at the same rate, and by inhibiting acetylcholinesterase is not going to help it in any way. So the long-term prognosis of the disease is therefore going to be unaffected by Aricept. So you see, by understanding the mechanisms of action of the drug, we can understand why things work and why things don't work, why things treat symptoms, why some things don't affect or do affect the long-term prognosis of the disease. So I hope this gave you a good understanding of Aricept and acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. Of all of the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, there are a lot of them, are going to work in the same sort of way. That is, have different areas that they work on, different lengths of time that they work for, but they all will work the same way, more or less. So I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.